Nora Sowell found the word before the sun was fully up. QUACK, sprayed across the hand-lettered sign of her little clinic, black paint dripping down over the careful letters she'd painted herself. Willow Root, it had said. Now it said something else. She stood on the sidewalk of Main Street in Hadley Fork and looked at it a long moment. She did not cry. She did not scrub it off. She picked up the tin watering can by the door, filled it at the rain barrel, and watered the pot of mint that grew beside the step. Then she went inside and turned on the lights. 3 weeks later, at the town meeting, a man named Brant Fowler stood up in front of 60 of his neighbors. He owned the urgent care clinic and the pharmacy attached to it, and he had a voice built for filling a room. "She sells weeds and calls it medicine," he said, and he let it land. "Don't bet your kids on a widow's garden." Nobody stood up for her. Not one person. And Nora, sitting in the back row in her gray coat, did not argue. She just looked at her hands. On a shelf behind her counter there was a medical bag, scuffed leather, an old brass clasp, gone dull with years. She never opened it. She dusted around it. She reached past it for the jars of dried elderflower and never once brought it down. And that same week, 50 miles upstream, in the dark, a rail tanker heavy with solvent was already leaning too far into a curve above Cabell Creek. Nobody in Hadley Fork knew it yet. Nobody knew either thing was about to matter. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you, subscribe so the next one does too. And do me a favor, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me tell you about Nora, and about the water, and about the day the whole town lined up at a door they'd spat on. Hadley Fork sits down in the Creek Valley where the hills fold close, about 3,000 souls give or take, an old coal and timber town that outlived both. There's one main street with the brick fronts leaning together, a diner, a hardware, a church with a white steeple, and the pharmacy at the end with Fowler's name on it in big blue letters. The creek runs behind the whole thing the way it always has, brown in spring, low and clear in fall, and the reservoir that gives the town its water sits 3 miles up in a green bowl of hills. People here don't have much and don't say much. They wave from trucks. They know each other's dead by name. Nora had come back to it the way people come back to the place that made them, which is to say tired, and looking for somewhere quiet to set down a weight. She'd grown up in Hadley Fork. Her mother had kept a little dry goods store in the storefront that was now the clinic, and the storefront had sat empty for years after the old woman passed. Nora bought it back with the last of what she and Tom had saved. She scrubbed the floors on her knees. She painted the sign herself, a coat of green and the letters in cream, and she named it for the willow that leaned over the water at the edge of town, the tree whose bark her grandmother used to boil for a fever before anyone in that hollow had ever seen a doctor. Willow Root Clinic. That was 2 years now after Tom died. 2 years of grief worn down to something she could carry through a day. She sold teas, steeped and strained and bottled in mason jars with cloth lids, elderflower for a cold coming on, willow bark for the ache that lived in old joints, chamomile and lemon balm for the ones who couldn't sleep, and there were more of those than you'd think in a town that had watched its work leave. She made salves in the back on a little 2-burner stove, calendula and beeswax, comfrey for a bruise, a green one that smelled of the woods that she rubbed into the hands of the men who'd broken their bodies underground. She charged almost nothing, a few dollars, sometimes a jar of somebody's beans, or nothing at all, because she could see when it was nothing at all. And she listened. That was the thing about Nora that the town couldn't quite figure how to price. A woman would come in for a sleep tea and stay 40 minutes at the little counter, and Nora would lean there with her hands folded and just let her talk. About the husband. About the boy who'd moved to Ohio. About the diagnosis she hadn't told anyone else yet. Nora had a stillness to her that made people set things down. She'd nod, slow, and pour the tea. And somewhere in the pouring the woman would feel lighter, and not be able to say why. Her hands were the other thing, if you watched them. Most people didn't. But her hands were sure in a way that didn't match the rest of her quiet. When she measured out a dried herb, she didn't fumble or spill. When she wrapped a jar in paper, the fold was clean and fast, done before you saw it start. Once a boy came in with a splinter driven deep and ugly under a thumbnail, crying, and his mother frantic, and Nora had the tweezers and the light and the whole thing done, and dressed so smoothly the boy stopped crying out of surprise. "There," she said, "you'll live to be 100. And the mother thanked her and never thought about it again, how it looked, those hands, how they knew exactly where to go. The town, mostly, found her harmless. That was the kind word for it. Old widow, sells her weeds, keeps to herself, no trouble. The unkind word came later, and it came from up the street. Because Brant Fowler did not find her harmless. Brant Fowler found her offensive to the natural order of things. He had built Fowler Family Care with his own name over the door, a proper clinic with a proper waiting room, and a pharmacy that filled the whole county's prescriptions. And on his wall behind the reception desk hung his framed degree and his framed license, and a photograph of himself shaking hands with the state senator. He was 44, and he was, in his own mind, the medicine of Hadley Fork, the only medicine. And down the street, a woman was handing people tea in jars and calling it a clinic, and it galled him. It genuinely galled him. Every jar she sold was, to Brant Fowler, a small theft from what was rightfully his. So it started with him, the way these things do. A word here. A raised eyebrow when a patient mentioned her. Willow Root, he'd say, and let the corner of his mouth do the rest. The pharmacist worked for him. Kip Aldous, a narrow man with reading glasses pushed up on his head, who'd stock a whole wall of cough syrup, but wouldn't keep so much as a bag of dried chamomile behind his counter. A woman came in one afternoon, an older woman with a cough that wouldn't quit, and she asked Kip, right out loud in the middle of the store, whether that elderflower thing from down at Nora's might help the tickle in her chest. And Kip laughed. Not cruel exactly, worse than cruel. Dismissive. "Don't waste your money on weeds," he said, loud enough for the 3 other customers to hear. "You want to get better? We've got real medicine right here." And the woman flushed and put down the thing she'd been holding and hurried out, and she did not go to Nora's after that. She'd been embarrassed out of it. That was the second stone. Nora heard about it. In a town of 3,000, you hear about everything. She was steeping a batch of lemon balm when a friend told her, one of the few women who still came regular, and Nora just nodded and stirred the pot. "Kip's a good pharmacist," she said. "He's not wrong that people should be careful." And that was all. She would not say a word against him. It was maddening, her friend said later. The woman won't defend herself to save her life. Then came the mother and the wheezing child. And that was the day the thing behind Nora's quiet nearly showed itself, though nobody in the room knew what they were looking at. It was a Tuesday, gray, a cold coming down the valley. A young mother named Rachel came in with a toddler on her hip, wanting a tea for her own throat, and while she stood at the counter, the little boy started to fuss, and then to cough, and then the cough went wrong. It got tight. It went high and thin at the end of each breath, a sound like a small door creaking, and the boy's face began to change. And Rachel was still talking, still fishing in her purse, still telling Nora about her sister's wedding. Nora was around the counter before Rachel finished her sentence. She didn't rush. That was the strange part, the part Rachel could never afterward describe. There was no panic in her at all. She was simply there, kneeling, one hand flat on the child's chest and the other tipping his chin, her whole body gone still and total, and her eyes were doing something behind them, fast. "Sit him up for me," she said, and her voice had changed. It had gone level and low and certain, a voice that expected to be obeyed and was. "Sit him right up, don't lay him back." Rachel obeyed without knowing why. Nora leaned close to the small chest and watched. "Count the breaths with me," she murmured. "Watch right here." She touched, Light, the soft place under the ribs. You see that little pull? That tug there, under the bone, every time he breathes in? That's called retractions. That means he's working too hard to move the air. See how the nostrils flare? We don't wait on that. She was already moving. She had a damp cloth, cool, at the back of the boy's neck. She had the door of the shop propped for the cold, clean air. She had her fingers at the side of his throat, feeling, and her eyes on a clock that wasn't there. "How long has the cough been like this?" she said, and it wasn't a question you could ignore. "Since this morning? Any fever? Has he ever done this before?" One after another, clean, no wasted word, the questions of somebody who already knew the shape of the answer she was hunting for and was only confirming which branch of it she was on. "All right, here's what we're doing. He's moving air, he's pink enough, but I don't like the sound, and I don't like the pull. This isn't a tea. We're getting in your car and we're driving to Vane's ER. Right now, and you're going to keep him sitting up the whole way, and you're going to keep talking to him soft so he stays calm. Because calm keeps the airway open. If that pull under the ribs gets worse, if his lips go dusky, if he goes quiet on you, quiet is bad, you pull over and you call. You understand me? Look at me. You understand." Rachel nodded, wide-eyed, holding her son. And then something moved across Nora's face. A kind of flinch. She heard herself. She heard the voice she'd been using, the one that hadn't come out of her in years. And she caught it and shut it, the way you'd close a door on a room you didn't want anybody to see into. Her shoulders came down. The stillness softened back into the herb woman they all knew. "He'll be just fine," she said. Gentle now, ordinary now, patting the boy's foot. Little ones scare us with that sound. "You go on and let the doctor have a listen, just to be safe." She helped Rachel to the car. She waved from the step. Rachel drove to the ER, and the doctor listened, and the boy was fine, croup and a scare, home by supper. And Rachel told the story that night as a funny thing, how she'd nearly had a heart attack in the tea shop. She never once registered what she had actually seen. She had no words for it. It looked to her like a kind old woman being kind. She would have laughed if you'd told her she'd just watched a professional read a child's breathing in 6 seconds flat, and make a triage decision faster than most doctors would. Nobody registered it. That was the whole tragedy of Nora Sowell, and the whole engine of what was coming. The thing she was hid in plain sight, behind jars of tea, and the town had already decided what she was. And people mostly only see what they've decided to see. That bag on the shelf, though, that bag had a history, if anyone had thought to ask, which they didn't. It had been Tom's illness that brought the bag home for good. Before that, before all of it, that bag had gone with her out the door every working day for a long, long time, to a place that was loud and bright and full of the worst hours of strangers' lives. But when Tom got sick, the real sick, the kind with a name and a number of months attached, Nora had done what she'd spent her whole life doing for people she didn't even know. She brought it home. She nursed him herself, through all of it, in their own bed, with the window that looked at the hills. And she was good at it, God. She was good at it. So good it frightened the hospice nurses who came and found there was nothing for them to do. And when Tom finally let go, on a soft morning in April, with her hand on his chest, she had set that bag on the highest shelf and had not opened it since. It sat there, with the dust settling on it. It was not, to her, a credential. It was not a resume. It was the thing she was holding the last time she was still the woman she used to be, and she couldn't look at it without looking at him. So she didn't look at it at all. That was where things stood when the town decided to make it official. There was a grant. A little state money for a community health fair, the kind of thing that comes to a place like Hadley Fork once in a blue moon. And there was a meeting at the town hall to decide who'd be part of it and how the money would be spent. And it drew a crowd. 60 people, maybe more, folding chairs in rows, and the councilwoman up front with her gavel. Dale Pruitt ran that council the way she ran everything, with a straight back and a firm opinion about propriety. And she had a list. And on that list, at first, was a table for Willow Root Clinic, because Nora had asked, quiet, whether she might set up and give away sleep teas and talk to folks about their gardens. Brant Fowler had other ideas. He stood up when the health fair came around on the agenda, and he had the room before he opened his mouth, because he was Fowler and this was his town's medicine. He talked about standards. He talked about liability. He talked about how a town that let just anybody hang out a shingle and call themselves a clinic was a town asking for trouble, asking for some child to be hurt because a well-meaning old woman gave the wrong advice. And then he turned, just slightly, so the whole room could follow his eyes to the gray coat in the back row, and he delivered the line he'd been polishing for weeks. She sells weeds and calls it medicine. A beat. Don't bet your kids on a widow's garden. The room did a thing rooms do. A ripple, half a laugh, quickly swallowed, and then quiet. An uncomfortable quiet, because it was mean and everybody felt it was mean. And not one soul stood up. Not the woman Nora had talked through her divorce. Not the man whose split hand she'd salved back to working. Not Rachel. 60 people who had, every one of them, at some point set something down at that little counter and felt lighter for it, and every one of them looked at their shoes. Nobody defends her. That's the part I need you to sit with. Nobody defended her. Dale Pruitt tapped her gavel. She said that in the interest of the town's good name, Willow Root would be struck from the fair, that the grant money would go to proper medical providers, and she said it in that firm, orderly, well-meaning way of hers. A woman who genuinely believed she was protecting people. A woman who trusted a license on a wall the way some people trust scripture. And Nora stood up. The whole room turned. This was the moment, if there was going to be one, the moment she'd tell them who she was, or defend the boy she'd sent to the ER, or say one single word about the salves in half the medicine cabinets in that valley. She stood there in her gray coat with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked, for a long second, at Dale Pruitt, and at Brant Fowler, and at the 60 pairs of eyes, waiting to see if the widow would make a scene. "All right," she said. That was all. All right. 2 words, level and without heat. And then she gathered her coat and walked out down the center aisle, unhurried, the door easing shut behind her, and she left them all sitting there in a silence that a few of them, if they were honest, would carry a while. She did not argue. She never argued. It was the most maddening, dignified thing any of them had ever seen. And most of them mistook it for defeat. After that, she got smaller. That's the only way to say it. She'd never been loud, but now she seemed to fold inward, and the town, having a permission slip now, folded away from her. The regulars thinned. Folks who'd have stopped in didn't want to be seen stopping in, not after Fowler had made it a thing you could be laughed at for. Kip refused to so much as say her name at the pharmacy counter. Somebody, a boy it turned out, a 17-year-old named Cody Hessler, who worked weekends stocking shelves for Fowler and did what boys do to please a man like that, took a can of black spray paint to her sign one night and wrote the word the whole town was already thinking. Quack, and Nora, the morning she found it, watered her mint and went inside and left the word up there for anyone to read, day after day, and I want you to understand that she left it up not out of defeat and not out of some grand statement. She left it up because scrubbing it would have meant she cared what they thought, and she had decided, a long time ago, in a room with her dying husband, that she was done spending herself on what people thought. Let them read it. She knew what she was. That was enough. She thought it would always have to be enough. It was around 3 in the morning, about a week after that the thing upstream finally let go. A Meridian rail freight, 40 cars, running the old line that follows the water down out of the mountains, and one tanker among them full of an industrial solvent, Ardent's product, a clear caustic thing with a chemical name too long for anybody to say, and a stretch of track that hadn't been inspected the way it should have been, and a curve above the creek. and gravity. The tanker came off the rails in the dark and rolled down the embankment and split, and its whole belly ran out slow and silvery into Cabell Creek, which runs 3 miles down into the green bowl of hills where Hadley Fork keeps its water. By dawn there was a sheen on the reservoir. By full light the smell had reached the valley, sharp and wrong, a smell that stung the back of your throat and made your eyes water if the breeze turned. And the phone started. The Tri-County Water Authority did what agencies do first, which is not enough. A boil notice went out on the emergency alert. Boil your water before use, as if boiling could touch this. And for a few hours the town half tried to go about its morning. Then the state lab numbers came back, and the notice changed to something with no soft edge on it at all. Do not use. Do not drink. Do not cook with it. Do not bathe in it. Do not let your animals near it. The contaminant, the lab said, was reading at 17 times the federal limit, and the plume was moving, and there was no timeline for when the water would be safe, only the word contained, which meant they'd stopped it from getting worse, not that anyone could touch it. And a town of 3,000 people, tucked in a valley 52 miles from the nearest real hospital, woke up on the second day with no water it could use for anything, and with people getting sick. They got sick faster than anyone was ready for. The ones who'd showered before the second notice, their skin came up in angry red patches, and their eyes burned. The ones who'd drunk it, coffee, a glass from the tap, started vomiting before noon. And the frail ones, the old lungs and the young lungs, the ones the fumes off the creek found first, they started to have trouble breathing. A deep, wet trouble, chemical pneumonitis, the doctors would call it later. The tissue of the lungs inflamed by something that had no business being in that air. Old men who'd survived the mines were sitting on their porches gray-faced and gasping. Babies were burning up with vomiting they couldn't stop, going dry and limp in their mother's arms, because when a small body loses water, it can lose it faster than you can put it back. Dr. Marcus Vane's County ER, 52 miles out, filled and overflowed in a single afternoon and went on divert, which is the word for a hospital raising its hands and saying we cannot take one more. The ambulances that Hadley Fork called stacked up in a line that stopped moving. 6 hours, they were told. Then 8. There were, someone estimated later, close to 600 people exposed in that valley, and there were not 600 beds within 100 miles, and there was no clean water to give any of them. And Brant Fowler's clinic, the medicine of Hadley Fork, the license on the wall, the only medicine that mattered, Brant Fowler's clinic ran dry in a day. His pharmacy shelves emptied of every antihistamine, every fluid, every mask. Gone in hours to the first wave of the panicked. His waiting room had 8 chairs. He had no beds. He had no oxygen at any scale worth the word. 1 or 2 tanks meant for a bad asthma day, not for a town. And he had no water, same as everybody. His sink's as poisoned as anyone's. He stood in the middle of his own clinic on the second afternoon, with the phone ringing off the wall, and people pounding at his locked glass door. And for the first time in his life, Brant Fowler had absolutely nothing to give them. And the town began, slowly, to understand that the man with his name over the door could not save them. Down the street, behind a green sign with a black word painted across it, Nora Sowell stood in the middle of her little clinic in the gray afternoon light and listened to the sound of a town in trouble coming through her walls. She could hear it. The sirens that went nowhere. The car doors. Somewhere, a child crying the particular cry that isn't temper. She had been standing very still for a long time. She turned and looked up at the high shelf. The bag sat where it had sat for 2 years. Brass clasp gone dull, leather scuff soft, a fine gray coat of dust on the top of it. The thing she couldn't look at because it had Tom's last morning folded up inside it. The thing that was, to her, not a credential but a grave. She heard the child cry again, out there, far off, and getting closer. And Nora Sowell reached up with both her sure and quiet hands and brought the bag down off the shelf. She set it on the counter, next to the register, in the flat gray light. For a moment she just rested her palm flat on the top of it. the way she'd rested her palm on Tom's chest, and she closed her eyes. And whatever passed through her in that second, she let pass. Then she worked the old brass clasp with her thumb, and it gave with a small, tired click that she felt more than heard, and she opened the bag for the first time in 2 years. She did not announce anything. She didn't call the council or the paper or knock on a single door. She simply began to move. She dragged the cots up from the cellar, the folding ones her mother had kept, and set them in rows across the clinic floor. She hauled out the jugs of water she'd been quietly storing all along in the back. Spring water she filtered and boiled and put by out of some old habit she'd never explained to anyone. Gallons of it. Clean, safe, hers, and lined them up by the door. She found a whiteboard and propped it on the counter. She rolled back the rug. She pushed the tea shelves to the wall. She was turning Willow Root into something else, with her sleeves rolled up and her mouth set, fast and without a wasted motion. And out of the open bag on the counter, she took what was inside it, item by item, and laid each thing out in its place. And then she went to the door, past the pot of mint, past the word QUACK, still black on the sign above her, and she unlocked it. And she propped it wide open to the cold, and she stood in the light of her own doorway on Main Street, where the whole sick town could see her, and she waited for them to come. She didn't have to wait long, because up the street, at that exact moment, a mother was running down the sidewalk with a small girl in her arms whose lips were going the wrong color, a little girl named Emmy, 6 years old, Dale Pruitt's own granddaughter. And there was no ambulance coming, and Fowler's door was locked, and somebody on that street was already pointing and saying the only thing left to say. Go to the widow. Go to Nora's. Her door's open. The mother came through the door still running, still calling the child's name, and Nora was already moving to meet her. Give her to me. Rachel, because it was Rachel, the same young mother whose boy had wheezed in this shop a season ago, didn't hesitate. She put the little girl into Nora's arms like she was handing over her own heart. Emmy's lips were the color of a bruise. Her chest was working too hard and getting too little. That small pull under the ribs, the one Nora had named out loud once and been forgotten for, was there now, deep and desperate, the soft tissue caving with every breath. On the cot. This one. Head toward me. Nora laid her down. Her hands did not shake. That was the first thing anyone in that room would have noticed, if anyone in that room had known to look. The panic was everywhere else, in Rachel's crying, in the door banging, in the sick people crowding the sidewalk, and it was nowhere in Nora's hands. She put 2 fingers to the child's throat. She bent her ear to the small mouth and listened. One full breath, then another. She heard the wet crackle down low. Chemical pneumonitis, the solvent vapor off the reservoir, breathed in by lungs 6 years old, cooking the tissue from the inside. Emmy, look at me, sweetheart. I know it's hard. I'm going to make it easier. She was already reaching into the open bag. Behind her, the door filled with more people. Word had run down Main Street faster than any car. The widow's door is open. Go to Nora's. And they were coming, the sick and the scared, and the ones who 3 weeks ago had sat in the church hall and said nothing while Brant Fowler called her a fraud. They were coming now, and they stopped in the doorway when they saw what she was doing, and they went quiet. Nora didn't have a hospital nebulizer. She had a shop. So she built one. She took a length of oxygen tubing from the bag, Tom's, from the last bad months, the tubing she'd never been able to throw away, and she rigged it to the small tank she kept for exactly no reason she'd ever admitted. 1 or 2 tanks in the back she'd bought after Tom died and never opened. She cracked the valve. She measured medicine into a cup by the light of the window, her lips moving with the arithmetic, weight against dose, the numbers coming up out of some deep well that had never once gone dry. She fit the mask to the child's face with one hand and held the small chin with the other. Breathe with me now. In. There you go. In. and the room watched a 6-year-old girl breathe. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing real ever does. But over 4 minutes, then 5, the terrible blue at Emmy's lips began to fade. The frantic pull under her ribs eased, one shallow degree, then another. Her eyes, which had been rolling loose and frightened, found Nora's face and stayed there. Nora talked to her the whole time. Low, steady, nonsense and comfort, the breath count, a story about the mint by the door, whatever kept the child anchored and calm, because calm was medicine too, and Nora knew it better than anyone alive in that valley. Dale Pruitt reached the door then. She had run 3 blocks and she could barely stand. She was 60 years old, and she was the woman who had struck Willow Root from the health fair with her own gavel, on grounds of propriety, and she came through the door of the clinic she'd condemned, and she saw her granddaughter alive on a cot, breathing, with the quack's hand cupped gentle under her chin. Dale Pruitt made a sound that wasn't a word. Nora didn't look up. She's turning the corner, the color's coming back. See it? Yes, I see it. She breathed a lot of that vapor. Her lungs are angry. She's going to need to be watched close for a few days, and she's going to be tired like she's never been tired. But she's going to be all right. A pause. You can come stand where she can see you. Children do better when they can see their people. And the councilwoman, who valued the license on the wall over the character of the woman under it, crossed the floor of the ramshackle little clinic and knelt by the cot and let a stranger she'd wronged tell her how to comfort her own grandchild. She didn't argue. She wasn't in a position to argue anymore. She just knelt there and held Emmy's small hand and watched the color come back into her face. And something in Dale Pruitt broke and rearranged itself quietly, the way a bone sets. It was while Nora reached back into the bag for a fresh line that the lanyard slipped out. It caught on the clasp and fell over the side and hung there against the scuffed leather, swinging a hospital badge on a worn cord. A photograph of a younger woman with the same steady eyes. A name, a title in letters too small for the frightened room to read from where they stood. Nora tucked it back without a glance, the way you tuck in a shirt, and went on working. But it had been out in the light for a moment, and a boy standing in the doorway, Cody Hessler, 17, the boy who'd climbed a ladder in the dark and sprayed quack across her sign, had seen it and didn't understand it yet, and would. There was no time to wonder. The door was still full of the sick. Because the derailment upstream had done its work in the night, and now the whole valley was paying. A Meridian rail tanker of ardent solvent had gone off the rails above Cabell Creek at about 3 in the morning, and by dawn there was a sheen on the reservoir, and by mid-morning the Tri-County Water Authority had stopped pretending it was a boil notice and called it what it was. Do not use. Do not touch. Do not drink. The state lab put the contaminant at 17 times the federal limit. Doctor, Vanes County ER was 52 miles out and already on divert. Ambulances were backed up past 6 hours. 600 people had breathed it or bathed in it or given it to their children before the warning came, and now they were burning-eyed and vomiting and short of breath. And the frail among them were drowning slowly on dry land. Fowler's pharmacy had run dry of everything in a single day. His clinic had no beds, no oxygen to speak of, and no clean water anywhere, none. Because the only water in Hadley Fork that hadn't come out of that poisoned reservoir was sitting in gallon jugs by the door of Willow Root Clinic, boiled and filtered and put by, gallon after gallon, by a widow who'd never quite been able to explain to herself why she kept doing it. She understood now. Her hands had always known something her grief kept trying to forget. They came all afternoon. Nora sorted them the moment they crossed her threshold. One look, a hand on a wrist, a question, the sickest to the cots, the walking wounded to the chairs, the merely frightened to the corner with a jug and instructions. She was triaging. She had a word for it that she didn't say out loud. She just did it, fast and sure, and the town that had called her weeds and water watched her run a field hospital out of a tea shop with nothing but a scuffed bag and 40 years of something she'd never told a soul. An old man named Harlan Boyd came in on his own 2 feet and went down on her floor between one step and the next. He just dropped. His wife screamed. Nora was across the room before the echo, on her knees, 2 fingers hard against the side of his neck, her ear to his chest. She sat back on her heels. He's arrested. Cody, the door. Keep it clear. You, sir. Off that cot. We need it. You can sit. Go on. She laced her hands over the old man's breastbone, and she began. The room had never seen anything like it. Compressions, deep and even and merciless. Her whole weight coming down through her locked arms, counting under her breath, a rhythm as steady as a clock. She reached into the bag without stopping and drew things out. A mask, an airway, a syringe, a small vial she read at arm's length, and drew up one-handed while the other hand never left his chest. She knew the drug. She knew the dose. She knew the rhythm his heart had gone into before anyone thought to ask, because she'd felt it die under her fingers, and she knew exactly what to do about it. Kip Aldous had come in the middle of it. The pharmacist, the man who'd told a customer at his own counter, loud enough for the whole store, not to waste her money on a widow's weeds, had come to Willow Root because Willow Root was the only place in the county with supplies. And he stood in the doorway with an empty crate in his arms, and he watched Nora Sowell bring a man back from the dead. Because that's what she did. 2 minutes, 3, the room holding its breath with her. And then Harlan Boyd's chest heaved on its own, and he coughed, and his eyelids fluttered, and Nora eased off him slow and steady, and put her fingers back to his neck, and felt a pulse under them, ragged and real. There you are, she said quietly. There you are, Harlan. Stay with me. We're going to get you up the road. Kip Aldous had gone the color of paper. He set the empty crate down very carefully, as if it might break, and he did not say a single word about weeds. You, Nora said to him, not unkind, just busy. You know supplies. I need saline, every bag you can find, and tubing and any oxygen your boss isn't using, and I need it now. Can you do that? Kip nodded. He couldn't seem to find his voice. He went. And that was how it went, hour after hour. Nora Sowell stood in the middle of the storm and turned it into order. She sorted the sick by how close they were to dying. She rigged rehydration for the ones the vomiting had wrung dry, the very old and the very young. The ones who couldn't hold water down, improvising lines from the clinic stock, threading them with a surgeon's patience, murmuring the whole time. She sent the walking well home with clean water and plain instructions written on her whiteboard in block letters anyone could read. She put the strong to work. She had volunteers now, neighbors who'd come sick and stayed to help, and she assigned them the way a charge nurse assigns a floor. Because that is what she was. That is what she had always been. And the herbs did their work too, right alongside the rest. She wasn't wrong about them. She'd never been wrong about them. She brewed strong ginger for the nausea and it settled stomachs the medicine couldn't reach, and honey and thyme for the raw coughing throats, and cool willow bark compresses for the fevers, and she explained each one plainly to whoever was helping. No mystery to it. Just the old knowledge standing shoulder to shoulder with the new. The tea shop and the trauma, bay in the same 2 hands. Both real. Both hers. By late afternoon, the light through her window had gone long and gold, and every cot was full, and Nora had not sat down once. That was when the pregnant woman crashed. Her name was Lorene, 7 months along, and she'd been sitting in the corner with a jug, one of the frightened but fine, until she wasn't. She went gray and slid down the wall, and her eyes rolled, and Nora was there before she'd finished falling. Blood pressure bottoming, the baby's fast heartbeat skidding under Nora's fingers. And the supplies were nearly gone. The saline down to the last bags, the oxygen guttering. The bag on the counter, emptier than it had been in 2 years. And that was the moment the door opened one more time, and a man in a windbreaker with a laminated badge and a clipboard stepped in over the threshold and stopped and looked around the crowded room and said, in the voice of a man reading from a rule, "Who's in charge here? This appears to be an unlicensed medical operation. I'm going to have to ask you to stop and clear this room." He was from the Water Authority. Compliance, he'd come to close her down. The whole clinic turned to look at him. Nora did not. Nora had her hands full of a mother and a baby who were both trying to die on her floor, and she didn't so much as glance up. "You can ask," she said. "I'm busy." "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I understand that this woman is 7 months pregnant and her pressure just fell off a cliff. And if you make one more sound that isn't useful, I'm going to have you carry water. Now get out of my light." The compliance officer opened his mouth. He looked at the room, the cots, the lines, the whiteboard, the old man breathing who shouldn't have been, the child pinking up in the councilwoman's arms, and something in him hesitated. But the rule was the rule, and he took a breath to say it again. And outside, engines, big ones, air brakes, and doors, and boots. The state disaster medical strike team had finally reached Hadley Fork. They came in fast and loud, in their marked jackets, with the gear the town had been praying for since dawn. And for a moment the little clinic was chaos of a whole new kind. And then the lead physician came through the door, a tall man, gray at the temples, moving with the quick certainty of someone who'd worked 100 disasters, and he took 2 steps into the room, and he stopped, as if he'd walked into glass. Because he was looking at Nora. She was on her knees over Lorene, her sleeves shoved up, a line in one hand, calling out a pressure and a heart rate and a plan without breaking rhythm. And Dr. Marcus Vane stood in the doorway of a tea shop in a poisoned town and looked at the woman who'd trained him 26 years ago when he was a green and terrified resident who didn't know a rhythm from a ruler, and his face came apart. "Sowell?" Nora looked up. Just for a second. Something crossed her face, not surprise, exactly, recognition, and a tiredness that went down to the bone. "Marcus. Good. This one's yours in a second. I've got a line in, but I'm out of saline." "Bottom shelf. Your people brought some. Go." And the great Dr. Marcus Vane, ER attending, strike team lead, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went. And the room heard him say it. They saved Lorene together. It took both of them and everything the strike team carried, but they brought her back from the edge and stabilized the baby's heartbeat and got her onto a real stretcher bound for a real hospital. And when it was done, when the crisis in the room had finally eased, Marcus Vane stood up in the gold afternoon light and looked around at the town crowded into Willow Root Clinic, and he wiped his face with the back of his wrist, and he said what he had to say. "I need to tell you people something." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. "I did my residency at St. Vincent's, Level 1 Trauma Center. The worst nights you can imagine. And the person who taught me how to keep someone alive when everything's going wrong, the person who taught half the doctors who came through that unit, was the charge nurse on that floor. 26 years she ran that trauma IQ. 26 years. He looked at Nora, who had turned her back and was already cleaning a line, who did not want this, who had never wanted this. Her name is Nora Sowell. And I want to understand something." He looked back at the room, and now there was an edge in it. "You had a level 1 trauma nurse living on your main street, and you called her a quack." Nobody moved. Fowler was there. He'd come at some point in the long afternoon, come to the only clinic with supplies with his own empty crate, the same as Kip. Because his pharmacy was dry, and his clinic was overrun, and he had nowhere else to go, and he had been standing near the back, saying nothing for an hour. Dale Pruitt was there, kneeling by Emmy. Kip was there, his arms full of the saline he'd carried in himself. Cody Hessler stood by the door where he'd been running water all day. The exact people who had shunned her stood in the room and heard a doctor say it plain. Someone reached into the bag on the counter. Vane did it himself, gentle the way you'd handle a relic, and lifted out the lanyard and turned the badge to the light and read it aloud so the room could hear. Nora Sowell, registered nurse. Charge nurse, trauma surgical EQ. He set it down. 26 years. And the vault that Nora Sowell had kept sealed since the day she carried it home to nurse her dying husband stood open on the counter of her mother's old store, in front of the whole town, in the last gold light of the worst day Hadley Fork had ever seen. The compliance officer with the clipboard cleared his throat. He'd been standing in the corner the whole time, forgotten, when he spoke. It wasn't to shut anything down, ma'am, he said carefully, given the situation, and I'd like to designate this site as an official overflow point, under emergency provisions, if you're willing to keep operating. Nora didn't stop cleaning the line. I was going to keep operating either way, she said, but thank you. It'll help with the supplies. He nodded and got out of the way and started filling out a different form. Then it was the town's turn, one by one, in the same room, before the same witnesses. Dale Pruitt stood up from beside the cot with Emmy in her arms. Emmy, breathing easy now, worn out and heavy-lidded and alive, her lips the ordinary pink of any sleepy 6-year-old. Dale came to Nora. She had run out of the gavel and the propriety and the grounds. She had an apology in her and it wouldn't come. It stuck in her throat like something too big to swallow. And she stood there with her mouth working and nothing coming out, holding the child she'd have lost. Nora looked at her, at Emmy, and she took the councilwoman off the hook, the way she'd been taking people off hooks her whole quiet life. She'll be tired for a week, Nora said. Let her sleep. Don't fuss her about it. Just let her sleep, and keep her drinking the clean water, and bring her back to me if the cough turns wet again. A small pause. She's a strong girl. You did right to run. That was all. That was mercy. And Dale Pruitt bent her head over her granddaughter and wept, because it would have been easier to be shouted at. Brant Fowler came next, though he didn't want to. He came because he had to. He came across the floor, with his empty crate held in front of him like a shield. The man who'd stood up in the church hall in front of 60 of his neighbors and said she sells weeds and calls it medicine. Don't bet your kids on a widow's garden. And now his own clinic was on divert, and his own shelves were bare, and there was nothing left in the whole Poison County except what this woman had put by, and he had to ask her for it. He stood at her counter. He couldn't quite look at her. I'm out of oxygen, he said, low and saline. My clinics, I've got people I can't treat. I came to ask if you'd. He stopped. He didn't have the word. And Nora Sowell, who had every right in the world to remember the meeting, who could have said one true sentence and finished him in front of everyone, looked at Brant Fowler for a long moment. And then she reached under her counter and took out 2 oxygen tanks, 1 or 2, all she had left, and a case of the saline the strike team had brought, and she set them on the counter in front of him. Take these, she said. The green regulators fit the pediatric masks. Send anyone you can't handle down here. I've got the beds now. And Brant, he flinched at his name. Your people are my people. Go take care of them. Not a word about the meeting. Not a word about the sign. She handed the man who'd tried to ruin her the tools to save the lives he couldn't, and she sent him back to his work, and it crushed him more thoroughly than any speech could have. He picked up the tanks. His hands weren't steady. He said thank you, in a voice barely there, and he went, a smaller man than he'd been that morning, and a better one, maybe, by the end. Kip the pharmacist didn't wait to be asked. He'd already started, sometime in the last hour, restocking her shelves with his own 2 hands, lining up what he'd carried in, organizing her supplies better than she'd had time to. The man who wouldn't refer a customer to her now inventorying her clinic like it was his life's work. When he caught her eye, he just nodded and kept going. Some apologies are spoken with the hands. And Cody Hessler, 17 years old, who had spray-painted QUACK across her sign in the dark 3 weeks ago because Fowler paid him, and it seemed like nothing. Cody had carried water all afternoon without being told, had filled jugs and hauled cots, and run for supplies until his arms shook, and when there was finally a lull he came and stood in front of Nora, red-faced, and couldn't get anything out either. "I did your sign," he said finally. "Miserable. It was me." The word. "I know it was you," Nora said. "I watched you climb the ladder." His face crumpled. "I'll clean it. I'll fix it. I swear I know you will," she said. "There's water needs carrying to the Boyd place first. Go on. We'll talk about the sign after." And she put him back to work, because work was the only forgiveness a boy like that could actually feel. And she knew it, the way she knew everything about the frightened human heart. She didn't humiliate a single one of them. She had the whole town in her hand and the entire ledger on her side, and she used none of it. She thanked them, and she gave them tasks, and she went back to her cots. And that, the plainness of it, the mercy of it, the way she simply had no interest in revenge, was the thing that finished the reckoning. You can armor yourself against an enemy. There's no armor against being forgiven by the person you wronged. The strike team worked through the night beside her, and in the morning, when the worst had passed, Marcus Vane found her by the window with a cup of her own tea going cold in her hands, watching the light come up gray over Main Street. "You could have told them," he said quietly. "Any time these 2 years. One sentence and none of this would have touched you." Nora watched the street. "Told them what?" she said. "That I used to be somebody? Everybody used to be somebody, Marcus." She turned the cup in her hands. "I came home to bury Tom. I didn't come home to be a nurse. I was just so tired of holding people while they died. A breath. I wanted to sell tea. I wanted small days. And instead the water went bad," she said, "and the bag was on the shelf." She almost smiled. It was always going to come down off that shelf sooner or later. Things don't stay put away just because you want them to. He looked at her a long moment. "It's good to see your hands work again," he said. She didn't answer that, but something eased around her eyes, and she drank the cold tea, and outside the sun came up on a town that would never again mistake what she was. The creek ran clean by autumn. It took the state that long. Meridian Rail and Ardent Solvents both hauled up in front of the accountability they'd spent all summer trying to duck. A cleanup fund pried loose dollar by dollar. The Tri-County Water Authority made to answer for the readings it had tried to soften. The lawyers did their slow work. It was neither fast nor satisfying, the way real justice against big things never is. But by October the tests came back clean, and the valley drank its own water again, and the frightened months began to fold into the past, the way hard times do. Willow Root Clinic never went back to being just a tea shop. The county recognized it now. Official, on the maps. A real clinic with real standing. Nora had trained a handful of volunteers through the crisis. Neighbors who'd found something in themselves on her floor those long days. And they ran shifts now under her eye. Took the small hurts, the fevers, the everyday griefs of a small town, and sent the big ones up the road to Vane with a clear-eyed note in the margin that the ER had learned to trust. The gallons of clean water still stood by the door out of habit that everyone now understood. The whiteboard stayed up. And the scuffed medical bag sat open on the counter where anyone could see it, in daily use, its brass clasp worn bright from opening. A working tool instead of a sealed-up grave. The sign got repainted. Cody Hessler did it, the way he'd promised. He sanded the black word off the old board, sanded it down to bare grain and then a little past, until there was no ghost of it left. And he lettered the name back on careful and slow Willow Root Clinic in a boy's earnest hand. He wouldn't take money for it. He came around most Saturdays after, actually, to carry things and fix things, and Nora let him, and nobody ever mentioned the ladder in the dark again. The little things settled into their new shapes. Brant Fowler still ran his clinic, still had his license on his wall, And he'd learned the hardest lesson a proud man can learn, which is the size of what he didn't know. He referred patients now, when they were past him, with 3 plain words that cost him something every single time: send them up to Nora's. He said it, and he meant it, and that was its own kind of penance served daily. Kip Aldous stocked her willow bark and her elderflower on his own shelves, and told his customers, when they asked, that the widow's remedies were the real thing. He'd seen it himself. And Dale Pruitt sat on the clinic's new board, the woman who'd struck it from the health fair, now signing the papers that kept its doors open, holding Emmy on her lap at the meetings. A healthy, loud 6-year-old with no memory at all of the day her lips went blue. Nobody in Hadley Fork ever quite said the word sorry, all together, out loud. Towns don't work that way. But they said it in 100 smaller currencies, in the casseroles left on her step, in the way conversation softened when she passed, in the fact that her name, which had been a small joke in certain mouths, was now spoken the way you speak of someone the town is quietly proud to have. There was one evening, late that fall, when a young family new to the valley stopped in, and the mother said something offhand about the herb lady, harmless, the way strangers do. And an old man sitting by the window, Harlan Boyd, whose heart had stopped on that very floor and been started again by 2 hands, set down his cup and told them the whole of it. The sign in the dark, the meeting where 60 of her neighbors watched a rich man call her weeds, and none of them stood up, and then the water, and the door she propped open to the people who'd shunned her, and the child who breathed, and the doctor in the doorway saying 26 years. He told it slow, and he told it true, and the newcomers looked over at the quiet, gray-haired woman brewing tea behind her counter with new eyes, the way the whole town had learned to. Nora pretended not to hear. She was good at that. And in the evenings, when the shifts were covered and the volunteers had gone home, and the long day was finally down to its embers, Nora Sowell would step out her front door onto Main Street, past the freshly lettered sign, and she would pick up the old tin watering can she kept by the step, and she would water the pot of mint that had grown all season into a thick and fragrant green, the same mint she'd watered the night the word went up, when she'd chosen not to scrub the sign but to tend the living thing instead, because that had always been the truer answer. She'd water it slow, in the last of the light, unhurried, a woman with nothing left to prove to anyone. A healer, the town had finally learned, isn't the thing that hangs on the wall. It's the thing that comes down off the shelf when your neighbor is dying on your floor, whether they were kind to you or not. It's in the hands. It was always in the hands. The mint would drink. The light would go soft and gold down the length of Main Street. And Nora would stand there in her own doorway a while, breathing the cool of the evening, before she turned and went back inside to the open bag and the quiet clinic and the small good days she'd finally, against all her wanting, learned to let herself be needed in. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this one traveled.